Wrestling is almost certainly the oldest sport in human history, and we don't just think that, we have actual archaeological evidence. Cave murals found in southern France, dating back somewhere between 15,000 and 20,000 years ago, depict what clearly looks like two figures grappling with each other, not hunting, not running from a predator, wrestling. Think about that for a second. The oldest paintings humans ever made. These incredible, beautiful pieces of prehistoric art, and tucked in there, among the bison and the handprints, is basically a UFC highlight reel, and it makes complete sense. Wrestling requires nothing. No ball, no track, no stadium, just two people. And the immediate question of, which one of us is stronger? It's the most fundamental athletic question you can ask, and humans have been asking it for at least 15,000 years. By around 2000 BC, Egyptian tomb paintings at a place called Beni Hassan showed incredibly detailed wrestling scenes. And I mean detailed, hundreds of figures, different holds, different takedowns, techniques that serious wrestlers would still recognize today. These weren't casual sketches, this was documentation. This was a culture that took wrestling seriously enough to carve it into the walls of their tombs. And across the ancient world, independently, with no contact with each other, different civilizations were doing the same thing. Sumerians wrestled, Greeks wrestled, Japanese developed sumo, Chinese had their own forms of competitive grappling. Every single culture, no matter where on the planet, looked at wrestling and said, yes, this is a sport. There's something deeply human about that. Now, while wrestling might be the most documented ancient sport, there's an argument to be made that running came first, because running isn't just a sport, it's literally how early humans survived. Here's a fun fact that sounds made up, but is completely real. Humans are one of the best long-distance runners on the planet, not the fastest. A cheetah would embarrass us over a short sprint, and honestly so would a horse. But endurance running, we're elite. There are tribes in parts of Africa that hunt by literally jogging after animals for hours until the animal collapses from exhaustion. It's called persistence hunting, and it works because humans don't overheat the same way most four-legged animals do. So, at what point did survival running become competitive running? Honestly, probably the moment the second human existed. The competitive instinct is that old. By the time we get to ancient Egypt, running was already formalized into a ceremonial event. There was something called the Heb-Sed festival, where the pharaoh, yes, the pharaoh himself, had to run a ritual course to prove he was still physically capable of ruling. Basically, every few years, the king had to pass a fitness test in front of everyone or face the extremely uncomfortable implication that maybe it was time for someone else to run the country. Literally. And then we get to Greece. And Greece, as they always did with everything, took running and made it into something magnificent and slightly unhinged. The first Olympic Games in 776 BC had one event, a single foot race called the Stadion, roughly 192 meters, the length of the stadium. That's it. That was the entire Olympics. One race. And yet thousands of people came to watch. City-states called temporary truces in their wars so athletes could travel safely, and the winner became a legend. Not a millionaire athlete with a sneaker deal, a literal legend. They wrote poems about the winners, sculptors carved their faces, they became heroes, all for running down a track. Also, and I feel like this deserves its own moment, the ancient Greeks competed in the Olympics completely naked. That was the whole thing. No uniforms, no compression shorts, just the human body, oiled up with olive oil, running as fast as it could. There's a story that a runner named Orsippus won a race in 720 BC specifically because he intentionally lost his shorts at the start because he ran better without them. And from that point on, all athletes just went nude. Ancient Olympics, absolutely unhinged. Okay, we need to talk about the ball game, because everything we've covered so far has been pretty understandable. Wrestling, running, these are things that make obvious physical sense. But what the civilizations of ancient Mesoamerica were doing with their ball game is on a completely different level. The Mesoamerican ball game is one of the oldest organized ball sports in human history, with evidence dating back to around 1400 BC. But here's what makes it insane. This wasn't just a game. This was a religious ritual, a political statement, and potentially a matter of life and death, all at the same time. The ball itself was made of solid rubber and weighed somewhere around 8 to 10 pounds. 10 pounds, that's like trying to play a game with a small bowling ball, and players couldn't use their hands or their feet. They had to use their hips, their forearms, and their knees to keep the ball in play. Try to picture that for a moment. Now imagine doing it in a heavy stone-lined court, in the middle of a city with thousands of people watching, and a massive stone ring mounted high on the wall that you somehow have to get the ball through. The courts themselves were architectural masterpieces. The most famous surviving one is at Chichen Itza in Mexico, and it's enormous. 168 roughly 8 meters long. The stone rings that served as goals are mounted 8 meters off the ground and are barely wider than the ball itself. Scoring through one of those wasn't just an impressive athletic achievement, it was basically a miracle. Now, here comes the part that historians have debated for decades. What happened to the losers? Or, depending on which interpretation you follow, the winners. There's evidence that suggests human sacrifice was connected to the ball game, that either the losing team, or in some theories the winning team, because being sacrificed was considered an honor and a direct line to the gods, might have been executed as part of the ritual. Archaeologists have found skulls carved into the walls of some ball courts. Carvings show beheaded figures. The imagery is pretty hard to ignore. Now, scholars argue about how universal this practice was. Not every game ended in death. Most were probably just sports, competitions between cities, political negotiations played out on a court. But the fact that the game existed in a cultural space where that outcome was even possible says something extraordinary about what ancient people believed sport could be. This wasn't entertainment. This was communion with the divine. The ball represented the sun. The court represented the universe. The players were enacting the cosmic struggle between life and death. Next time someone tells you a sports game doesn't really matter, just remember, at some point in human history, it really, really did. Let's take a breather and go to Egypt, because ancient Egypt is basically the civilization that had a sport for everything. We've already talked about wrestling and running, but the Egyptians were doing so much more. Tomb paintings and hieroglyphs document a staggering variety of athletic activity: swimming, archery, javelin throwing, weightlifting, rowing, long jumping, gymnastics, and various ball games. There was even a version of field hockey. Paintings from around 2000 BC show players with curved sticks and a ball facing off against each other. Think about that. Field hockey, 4,000 years ago. Someone in ancient Egypt invented field hockey. Swimming was particularly popular along the Nile. For obvious reasons, when your entire civilization is built around a massive river, swimming isn't just a sport, it's a survival skill. But Egyptian nobles trained in it competitively, and it was considered a mark of physical education and elite status. Archery in Egypt started purely as a military and hunting skill. The pharaohs were depicted as extraordinary archers, because nothing says, "I am the divine ruler of the most powerful civilization on earth," like being able to shoot a target from a moving chariot. But over time, archery competitions became a form of sport in their own right. And here's my favorite detail from ancient Egyptian sports. There's evidence of fishing competitions, organized fishing tournaments, men competing to catch the most or the largest fish, with judges and audiences, and presumably intense trash talk about each other's bait technique. Ancient humans fished competitively. Of course they did. Of course. We can't talk about ancient sports without spending serious time in ancient Greece, because the Greeks didn't just play sports, they turned sports into philosophy. The ancient Olympics began in 776 BC and ran continuously for over 1,000 years. Let that sink in. The Super Bowl has been going for about 60 years. The Olympics we're talking about ran for 12 centuries. It was the most durable sporting institution in human history until a Roman emperor shut it down in 393 AD because he thought it was a pagan celebration, which, to be fair, it was. But the Greeks didn't just have the Olympics. They had 4 major Pan-Hellenic games: the Olympics at Olympia, the Pythian Games at Delphi, the Isthmian Games near Corinth, and the Nemean Games. Collectively, winning all 4 was called the Grand Slam of the ancient world, and athletes who did it were worshipped like gods. The events themselves evolved over the centuries. That original single-foot race at the first Olympics gradually expanded into a full athletic program, multiple running distances, including a race in full armor. Imagine sprinting in a bronze helmet and leg guards. I can barely run in regular shoes. Long jump, discus throw, javelin, wrestling, boxing, and the most feared event of all, the pancration. This word translates roughly as all force or all power, and it was exactly what it sounds like: mixed martial arts, ancient Greek MMA. Almost anything was allowed: punching, kicking, choking, joint locks. The only things banned were biting and eye gouging, which tells you a lot about what the fight looked like if they needed to specifically ban those things. Pancration fighters became legends. There are stories of competitors who won matches after they had already been choked unconscious because their body kept fighting on reflex. There are accounts of fighters who won by dislocating their own joints to escape holds. This wasn't a gentlemanly sport. This was extraordinary violence with minimal rules, performed in front of tens of thousands of screaming spectators. And the prize for winning all of this? A wreath of leaves. That's it. Olive leaves at Olympia, laurel at Delphi, pine at Corinth, wild celery at Nemea. No cash, no sponsorship deal, just a crown of plants and eternal glory. The ancient Greeks had a concept, arete, that meant excellence, the fulfillment of your potential. Sports weren't just games, they were the highest expression of what a human being could be. Your body was sacred. Your athletic performance was a form of prayer. I want to give chariot racing the attention it deserves because it might be the most genuinely dangerous popular sport in human history. Chariot racing in the ancient world, particularly in Rome, where it was held at the Circus Maximus, attracted crowds of up to 250,000 people. 250,000 people in one stadium watching chariots race. The Circus Maximus was the largest sports venue ever built in human history. Modern football stadiums hold 80,000 to 100,000 at most. Rome was doing more than double that 2,000 years ago for chariot races. The races were 7 laps around a central barrier called the spina. The turns were tight, the speeds were fast. Drivers were usually lightly built young men, often slaves, who wrapped the reins around their bodies so they could use their whole torso to steer. The problem with that design, as you might have already noticed, is that if you crashed, and crashes happened constantly, you couldn't just let go. You were tied to the reins, which meant you were being dragged at speed behind 2 panicking horses. The good drivers carried a curved knife, called a falx, specifically to cut themselves free before the horses trampled them. This was primetime entertainment. This was the Roman Super Bowl. The 4 main racing teams, the Blues, Greens, Reds, and Whites, had fan bases so intense that they occasionally rioted. In Constantinople, in 532 AD, a riot between the Blues and Greens faction got so out of control that it basically turned into a full revolution. Tens of thousands of people died. The Emperor Justinian nearly fled the city over chariot racing team rivalries. People have strong opinions about their sports teams, but ancient Rome took it to a completely different dimension. Here's what I think is the most interesting part of all of this. When you look at all these ancient sports, wrestling in prehistoric caves, Egyptian swimmers competing on the Nile, Mesoamerican athletes risking their lives for a rubber ball, Greek philosophers watching naked men throw up discs, you start to notice something. Every single civilization, regardless of geography, regardless of time period, regardless of how isolated they were from each other, invented sports. Not one ancient culture looked at the concept of physical competition and said, nah, that sounds exhausting, let's just not. Because sports aren't just entertainment. They never were. They're a fundamental human technology. Sports create social bonds. When you're part of a team, when you share a loss or a victory with someone, you build a connection that's almost impossible to replicate any other way. Ancient communities needed those bonds. A group of people who had trained and competed together were more likely to cooperate, more likely to trust each other, more likely to function as a unit when real threats appeared. Sports are also a safe container for conflict. Instead of going to actual war, every time 2 neighboring tribes had a dispute, you could settle it on a field. The Mesoamerican ballgame was partly a political tool. City-states negotiated through competition. The Olympic truce in Greece literally paused wars, so athletes could travel to the games safely. Sport as diplomacy, sport as peace. And sports are a way of answering a question that never stops being interesting. What is the limit of what a human body can do? That question drove a prehistoric person to wrestle a stranger in a cave. It drove a Greek athlete to train for years, to throw a discus 6 feet further than anyone had thrown it before. It drives people today to obsess over hundredths of a second on a swimming clock. The game changes, the technology changes, the rules change, but the question stays the same. Some ancient sports survived. Wrestling, running, javelin, discus. They're all still in the modern Olympics, essentially unchanged in their basic structure. When you watch the 100-meter dash at the Olympics, you are watching a direct descendant of a foot race that Greeks held in 776 BC. Others didn't make it. The pancration disappeared for centuries, though modern MMA is basically its spiritual heir. Chariot racing faded with the fall of Rome, though you could argue Formula One carries its energy. The Mesoamerican ball game continued in various forms until the Spanish conquest effectively wiped it out in the 16th century, and some were lost completely. Not just the games, but the rules, the rituals, the exact meaning. There are cave paintings that clearly show people engaged in some kind of competitive activity that we simply can't identify anymore. Games that were played for thousands of years, that left no name, no rulebook, no description. Just an image on a stone wall of someone doing something that clearly mattered enough to record. That's the part that gets me. The effort people made to play, to compete, to watch, to care about outcomes in the context of something that was, ultimately, a game, that effort is visible across every corner of human history, even when everything else about those people has been erased, even when we've lost their language, their names, their stories, the sports remain. So, what sports did ancient humans play? All of them. Wrestling and running before civilization existed. Organized ball games that doubled as cosmic rituals. Swimming competitions along rivers sacred to gods. Boxing matches where the prize was a few leaves and immortal fame. Chariot races in stadiums so large they make modern venues look modest. Games we don't have names for, played by people we'll never know, in front of crowds long turned to dust. Sport is not something humans invented at some point in history and decided to keep doing. Sport is something that emerges from being human. It shows up wherever we show up. It has since the beginning, and the next time you feel that irrational, almost involuntary rush when your team scores, that feeling that bypasses logic and goes straight to something older and more animal in your chest, that's not new. That's 15,000 years old.